Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. The Great Pyramid of Giza evokes all sorts of emotions and reactions. It's easy to marvel at the sheer size and scale of it. It's just over 481 feet tall. That's nearly 50 stories high. 2.3 million blocks was the original estimate. Computer estimates put it at around 590,000 blocks, but hey, that's still a lot. And it covers 13 acres. Now, people typically wonder, how in the world was this thing built? They don't really so much ask who built it. Of course, we all know who built it. We have to give credit where credit's due, but just bear with me. For the sake of our episode today, we're going to be talking about how a certain group of people might have built the pyramids. How about the ancient Israelites? Now, in 1998, presidential candidate Ben Carson said in a commencement speech that he believed that the Israelites built the pyramids. Is that possible? Can that work out? Is that really the answer? Let's find out. Why would the Israelites be a candidate for building the pyramids? I know, just bear with me. We all know that it was aliens, but again, for the sake of the episode, indulge me. The answer is really the bondage in Egypt. This is why certain people, like Dr. Carson, gravitate toward the Israelites. The Bible's quite clear that the descendants of Jacob, his 12 sons and their families, spent centuries in Egypt, a major portion of which included involuntary servitude. God had foretold that set of circumstances to Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, before Jacob was even born. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years." That's Genesis 15:13. Now initially, Jacob and his sons and their families were welcomed in Egypt by Pharaoh, and that was really due to the respect and affection for Joseph that Pharaoh had. Again, Joseph was a son of Jacob who had been sold into slavery years earlier. Those circumstances soon changed, though, after the death of both Pharaoh and Joseph. The Israelites were no longer popular. In Exodus chapter 1, we read this: "Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us, and escape from the land.' Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel." Now, Exodus 1:11 is kind of a key verse here. It mentions Pithom and Ramses. The only thing that we're really told in the Bible about what the Israelites built is that verse, the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. That's now known as Tel el-Daba, and it's been excavated in some detail. It's in the Delta region of Egypt. But maybe you might think, we may not have all the data. Maybe there's something that's been overlooked. Is the idea that the Israelites built the pyramids and not just these two store cities valid? The short answer to whether the idea that the Israelites built the pyramids is plausible is no. At least if you care about what the Bible says about the chronology of its own events. Demonstrating how the Bible itself refutes the belief that the Israelites built the pyramids is not difficult. First, we need to establish the Bible's own chronology, and then following that, we need only to synchronize the Bible's chronology with that of ancient Egypt, and that will produce our answer. Let's take a look at the chunk of time from the beginning of Abraham's life to the end of Joseph's life. Now we learn from Genesis 12:4 that Abraham was 75 when he left Haran to journey to Canaan. 25 years later, we learn in Genesis 21 verse 5, Abraham and Sarah had Isaac. That would mean Abraham was then 100 years old. 60 years later, Isaac, of course, would have been 60. Jacob was born, according to Genesis 25, verse 26. 130 years after that, Jacob is found in Egypt under the care of Joseph, according to Genesis 47, verse 9. Jacob died roughly 17 years later at the age of 147, according to Genesis 47:28, and Joseph was still in Egypt at that time, and of course for the events of Genesis 48 through 50, Joseph is there as well. So consequently, from the time Abraham was born to the end of Jacob's life, and of course the height of Joseph's influence, 307 years had elapsed. Our next chronological chunk would be from the time of Joseph to the Exodus under Moses. According to Exodus 12:40, the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt lasted 430 years. Since God had said in Genesis 15:13 that Israel would be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, not 430, the difference is taken by many scholars to indicate that the bondage in Egypt began 30 years after Jacob arrived in Egypt. Given the previous information, if this suggestion about the number 430 by scholars is correct, Joseph lived 13 more years in Egypt after Jacob died. The last 40 years of the 430-year period noted in Exodus 12:40 would have been the time Moses lived in Egypt, since Acts 7:23 puts him at the age of 40 when he had to flee Egypt. Exodus 7 verse 7 and Acts 7:30 establish the fact that 40 years after Moses had fled Egypt, he returned, having been commissioned by God to demand that Pharaoh give the Israelites their freedom. After leading the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses lived another 40 years, the period of the wilderness wandering, and died at the age of 120, according to Deuteronomy 29:5, 31:2, and 34:7. We can make a few summary observations now about the biblical timeline. From the birth of Abraham to the death of Jacob, we had 307 years. Then we had 13 years after Jacob died, Joseph's death. The Israelite bondage period occurred from the time Joseph died until the Exodus, 400 years in round numbers, according to Genesis 15, verse 13. Consequently, there were 720 years from the birth of Abraham to the end of Israel's bondage in Egypt. Now I'm going to ask you to hold that number in your head, 720, and we're going to ask another question. How do we relate all of that to real BC time and Egyptian history? Well, the key for that question is a particular verse in the Bible, 1 Kings 6:1. Now that verse tells us about the 4th year of Solomon's reign, that it was 480 years from the time of the Exodus. Now, according to valid astronomical dates in the Bible correlated with astronomy, in other words, and we get that from Assyrian overlaps with biblical history, Solomon's 4th year would have been 966 BC. So what we do here is we take 966, and then we take the 480 from 1 Kings 6:1, and since we're going back in time, we add those numbers, but we head in reverse. So 960 plus 480 is 1446 BC. That would be the year of the Exodus by the literal numbers given to us in the Bible. Now we can add some of the numbers associated with the Israelite bondage to complete the chronological picture. Adding, that is, moving backward in time, the 400 years of Egypt's enslavement of the Israelites in Genesis 15:13 to 1446 gives us a date of 1846 BC for Joseph's death. Since Joseph lived 110 years, according to Genesis 50, verse 22, his lifespan would work out to 1956 BC to 1846 BC. And that is what kills the idea that the Israelites built the Great Pyramid. You might ask, well, how? Well, we know from Egyptian chronology, and we get this information from king lists, it's exactly what it sounds, lists of kings in Egyptian monuments and documents, like the Abydos stela, the Palermo stone, and of course correlating that with astronomy. We know from Egyptian information that the Great Pyramid was built in the reign of Khufu. That's during the Old Kingdom. Specifically, the Old Kingdom was roughly, again using Egyptian material, 2649 BC to 2150 BC. And reminder, that information is verified astronomically. So 2649 BC to 2150 BC is the Old Kingdom. Khufu's reign was roughly 2589 to 2566 BC, and that was when the Great Pyramid was built. Now, all of that means that the pyramids were standing centuries before Joseph was ever born. According to the biblical numbers correlated with the Egyptian numbers, they were standing even before Abraham was born. Now, if the pyramids were already standing, of course, the Great Pyramid being the most prominent, by the time Abraham was born, that means they were built well before not only the time of Joseph, but the time of Moses and the Exodus. The period of the Israelite bondage in Egypt has nothing to do, chronologically, it can't, with the building of the Great Pyramid. The bottom line is that if one accepts the biblical record at face value, the Israelites could not have built the pyramids. And of course, the Bible never claims that they did. That's entirely consistent, in fact, with what the Bible actually tells us. Remember, in Exodus chapter 1, all that the Israelites were even said to have built, specifically, were the storehouses of Pithom and Ramses. There is no record of the Israelites building the pyramids in the Bible. This is actually a good example of sort of believing something about the Bible that it never in fact says. Thanks for watching Fringe Pop 321. Please check out our website for more information on this episode and of course other episodes. And come back and watch again, because what you know may not be so.